When Spanish conquistadors showed up in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they saw things that shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. Today, archaeology has confirmed a lot of what they wrote about. The Mexica people, that's what we call Aztecs, did rituals that were brutal no matter how you look at it. Here are the cruelest things they actually did, backed up by historical records and modern dig sites. At number 15, we need to talk about their legal system and how they handled criminals. The Codex Mendoza shows us exactly what happened to people who broke the rules. Commit adultery, public stoning. Steal something, execution. Young person caught drunk in public, death sentence. But if you were old, you could drink as much as you wanted. The Aztecs believed the elderly had earned that right. These executions weren't done in secret either. They happened in public where everyone could see. The message was obvious. Follow the rules or become an example. Parents did similar stuff at home. The Codex shows children being stabbed with cactus thorns, tied up, or forced to breathe in chili pepper smoke as punishment. These images were painted right after the Spanish conquest, but they show real practices that actually happened. Another text called the Florentine Codex backs this up with written descriptions of these penalties. The cruelty wasn't random, it was planned. Every public execution and every punishment was basically a lesson to everyone watching. The government used fear to teach obedience. Number 14 takes us to the ball game. A lot of people think the ball game involved human sacrifice. Here's where we need to separate what's real from what's myth. Yes, the classic Maya connected ball games to cutting off heads in their artwork, but for the Aztecs and Tenochtitlan, the proof for regular ball game sacrifices is actually pretty weak. They had ball courts in their sacred area, and sacrifices could happen nearby, but the massive skull displays, heart removals, and skin-wearing ceremonies are way better documented than any ball game killings. This matters because we want to stick to what archaeologists and historians can actually prove. The Aztecs did plenty of documented brutal stuff without needing to add things that probably didn't happen the way people think. At number 13, we saw how they turned human bodies into objects even after death. When archaeologists dug at the Templo Mayor, they found skull masks. These were actual human skulls that had been modified, decorated with fancy materials, and worn during ceremonies. They also found bones arranged in ritual patterns. A researcher named Jimena Chavez Balderas documented how skulls moved through Aztecs' religious life as powerful objects. They would rework them, keep them for a while, and then finally bury them as offerings. This wasn't just about killing people, it was about continuing to use the dead as raw materials. The cruelty kept going even after death. Number 12 is arrow sacrifice. The Aztecs called it Tlacaxipehualiztli. During certain festivals, they would tie up victims and shoot them with waves of arrows. The point wasn't to kill them fast. They wanted the blood to flow onto the earth. This was a ritual metaphor for watering the fields with life force. The Florentine Codex describes these scenes happening during festivals for Totec, the flayed god, and in farming ceremonies. The connection between human blood and crops growing was totally explicit. Cruelty here came from how it was staged. It wasn't one arrow and one death. It was multiple wounds designed to bleed the victim out slowly while the blood fell on the ground like rain. At number 11, we find gladiatorial sacrifice on a stone platform called Tlacaxipehualiztli. Here's how it worked. They would capture a warrior and bring him to a round stone platform. Then they'd tie his ankle to the stone with a rope. He'd have to fight a series of elite Aztec warriors, but here's the cruel part. They gave him a weapon with feathers on the edge. It was basically useless. Meanwhile, his opponents had real weapons. The fight was designed so he couldn't win. Eventually, he'd fall, and then they'd sacrifice him right there. Spanish writers like Sagun and Duran describe these events in detail. Archaeologists debate which exact stones were used for this, like the stone of Tlaloc. But museum labels and academic sources agree that gladiatorial sacrifice really happened. Some carved stone discs even had fittings in the center that could have held the rope. The victim got to show his bravery, but under conditions that guaranteed he would die. It was theater with only one possible ending. Number 10 brings us to something that still surprises researchers today. For a long time, everyone assumed sacrificial victims were mostly male warriors captured in battle. Then archaeologists uncovered the Tzompantli, the great skull rack under modern Mexico City. When they analyzed the more than 600 skulls they found there, they discovered something unexpected. Yes, there were men of fighting age, but there were also women and children. This matched what Spanish writers had described, but critics thought they were exaggerating. The archaeology proved the Spanish were telling the truth. The range of victims was wider than anyone thought. The government had official ritual reasons for killing even the most vulnerable people in society. Most of these skulls date to the late 1400s during the reign of a ruler named Ahuizotl. Killing, beheading, and display of skulls wasn't occasional, it was systematic. At number 9, we need to talk about cannibalism. This is where a lot of myths need clearing up. Yes, ritual cannibalism happened in some contexts, especially among elites and during key festivals like Tlacaxipehualiztli. The bone evidence from the Templo Mayor area shows processing after death that looks like removing flesh and cooking in some cases. The historical texts are clear that certain captors could receive cooked portions of a victim's limbs. But here's what didn't happen. Older theories said the Aztecs regularly ate human flesh to make up for not having enough protein in their diet. Scholars now mostly reject that idea. The current understanding is that cannibalism was ritual and happened only sometimes. It meant something as a religious act and a display. It wasn't a food source. The Tzompantli excavation showed a process of kill, behead, remove flesh, display, and then cement the skulls into towers. There's no evidence of regular kitchens for this. Where cannibalism shows up in the archaeological record, it's tied to ritual contexts or ceremonial warfare, not daily meals. Number 8 takes us to a ceremony that happened once every 52 years. The Aztecs used a calendar system where every 52 years marked the completion of a full cycle. They called this ceremony Tzompantli, the binding of years. At midnight, they put out every single fire across the empire. Every temple and every household went dark. Then they brought a sacrificial victim to a hill outside the city called Tlacaxipehualiztli. They killed the victim there, and some sources say they started the new fire right in the chest cavity of the body. Other sources say they pulled out the heart first and then drilled the new flame at that spot. Either way, the victim's body became the human fireplace where the new age began. Runners then carried this fire to relight every temple and household throughout the empire. The psychological impact must have been incredible. Total darkness, the sacrifice, then light returning to the world. Government terror and comic reassurance combined in one ritual. The message was obvious. The world could end if the gods weren't fed. At number 7, we encounter the Flowery Wars. The Aztecs called them Xochitlotl. These were ritualized battles that the Triple Alliance, which included Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, fought against their neighbors, especially the Tlaxcalans. But these wars followed specific rules. The goal wasn't to kill enemies on the battlefield, it was to capture them. Warriors who captured enemies gained status, and the prisoners fed the sacrificial system. Historians debate how much of this was about military training versus religious quotas, but even skeptics agree the system reliably produced captives who ended up on temple steps. The cruelty here was built into the structure. They designed warfare specifically to create a supply chain for human sacrifice. Combat became farming for bodies. Number 6 brings us to the festival Tzompantli, and what happened to female victims. Most sacrificial victims were men, but some rituals specifically required women. During Tzompantli, they chose a young woman to represent Tosi, the Earth Mother. At the climax of the festival, they killed her by cutting off her head. Then they skinned her body, and priests wore her skin in ceremonies meant to renew the world at the end of the rainy season. Researcher Carolyn Dodds Pennick notes that while many male victims were beheaded after death, some women were actually killed by beheading itself. The intersection of gendered symbolism and ritual violence here is particularly disturbing. They believed wearing the goddess's skin, which was really a woman's skin, could regenerate the earth. At number 5, we find the year-long god impersonator for Tezcatlipoca. Every year they chose a physical, perfect young man to become the god Tezcatlipoca. They gave him expensive clothes, servants, and 4 women to serve as his wives, who represented goddesses. For an entire year, he lived like royalty. He walked through the city being honored and celebrated. But he knew from day one how it would end. On the feast day of Tezcatl, he would climb the temple steps, break his flutes, which symbolized his transformation, and calmly offer himself for heart removal. The emotional cruelty was part of the design. They staged beauty, pleasure, and high status for a full year just to destroy it in public. The Getty's digital Florentine Codex lets you see the actual illustrated pages showing this youth in jewels and fancy feathers, and then the final sequence leading to his death. Modern scholars point out how the ritual created a theatrical arc with music, parades, and timed events that all built toward his execution. Number 4 takes us to gladiatorial combat and ritual skinning during the festival of Tlacaxipehualiztli. Few rituals read as viscerally cruel as this one. The Florentine Codex describes captured warriors being killed and then skinned. Priests or chosen participants would wear these skins and parade through the city for days. They weren't pretending to be Xipe Totec, the flayed god. According to Aztec belief, they were actually hosting the god's presence through what scholars called the god's social skin. Sometimes they wore these skins until they started to rot. This shocking spectacle was meant to represent farming renewal, like a seed shedding its old shell. The festival also included gladiatorial contests and arrow sacrifices, with blood directly compared to the rain that makes corn grow. The core sequence of heart removal, skinning, and wearing the skins appears throughout the historical record in Aztec artwork. Researchers like David Carrasco point out how the ritual combined charisma and terror. Watching someone wear another person's skin for days wasn't just horrifying, it was also weirdly compelling, which made it even more effective as government power. At number 3, we have to discuss child sacrifice to the rain gods. The historical sources describe children being offered to Tlaloc and other rain gods during the spring festival of Tlacaxipehualiztli and at other key times. Here's the disturbing detail. According to Sagun's Nahuatl sources, crying of the children was seen as a good sign for heavy rains. Later writers exaggerated this into extreme claims about forcing children to cry, but the core point that tears had ritual meaning comes straight from the primary sources. The archaeology makes this even more sobering. Excavations at the Templo Mayor have identified at least 42 children dedicated to Tlaloc. These burials include characteristic offerings and show health problems common in children selected for sacrifice. A separate mass burial at Tula, which predates the Aztec period but shares the same ritual tradition, shows 49 children with cut marks indicating skinning and beheading. The authors of that study discuss crying as part of the ritual around rain offerings. Researchers have also connected spikes in child offerings to environmental disasters. A mass of infant burials at the Templo Mayor has been linked to the one rabbit drought of 1454 when famine hit the region hard. When the rains failed, the Aztecs killed more children to make the gods bring water back. Number 2 is the skull rack, or Tzompantli. The Aztecs displayed several heads on wooden racks, and they also built towers out of skulls cemented together with lime. In 2015, archaeologists found the Tzompantli, Great Skull Tower, underneath modern Mexico City. They've now documented more than 600 skulls in this structure. Spanish writers describe these displays, and critics accuse them of exaggerating for centuries. The archaeology proved the Spanish weren't making it up. Science magazine's detailed report on the excavations described the process. Victims were killed, typically by heart removal. Then they were beheaded. The skulls were stripped of flesh and drilled with holes on the sides. They threaded the skulls onto wooden poles for the racks. After display, some were cemented into the tower rings. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a construction project that required stone quarrying, woodworking, lime processing, and regular supplies of human remains. The result was a permanent government-sponsored landscape of skulls that combined religion and intimidation. It dominated the sacred area. Anyone walking through the center of Tenochtitlan would see it and understand what happened to enemies of the state. At number 1, we have the practice that defines Aztec sacrifice in most people's minds: public heart removal on the Great Pyramids. If there's one image everyone associates with the Aztecs, it's the heart being torn from a living person's chest on the temple altar. Sagun's Book 2 records this happening repeatedly across the 18 monthly festivals, and the imagery appears constantly in Aztec art. Modern bone analysis confirms the historical descriptions. At Tlatelolco and related sites in the capital area, analysts have found cut marks and trauma at the chest end of ribs exactly consistent with opening the chest and removing the heart. Bodies and body parts were then treated in specific ways, from beheading to display to placement in ritual offerings. The heart removal scene was part of a theater of power that used the Templo Mayor's very architecture. At the base of the southern staircase, on Huitzilopochtli's side, sits the famous Coyolxauhqui disc. It shows the dismembered moon goddess. When priests threw bodies down the steps after sacrifice, they landed on this disc, reenacting the god's mythical victory over his sister. It also warned enemies what would happen to them if they defied Tenochtitlan. The temple's design, its stairways, and its giant stones intentionally staged these violent spectacles in front of the entire city. The killing wasn't hidden. It was the centerpiece of state festivals, formed on twin staircases and plazas packed with spectators, dancers, and musicians. The calendar guaranteed this happened regularly, and big events like temple dedications produced peak spectacles. Spanish writers gave huge numbers for the 1487 rededication of the Great Temple under Ahuizotl, claiming anywhere from 20,000 to over 80,000 victims. Modern scholars think the highest figures were propaganda or logistically impossible, but even conservative estimates put it in the thousands over multiple days with multiple killing platforms. What matters isn't the exact count, it's the combination of public scale, which the skull tower proves, the regularity from the festival schedule, and the ritual refinement. This wasn't random violence, it was systematic. By modern standards, these practices were extraordinarily violent, but they weren't random sadism. For the Mexica, sacrificial blood linked human communities to a cosmic system. According to their beliefs, the gods had sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion. Humans had to pay that debt back through offerings, including human lives. That logic shaped warfare, state festivals, and criminal justice. The cruelty was effectiveness in their worldview.